This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include syndicated columnist and author John Hood, Brad Crone, political consultant, Becki Gray with the John Locke Foundation, and Chris Fitzsimon, political analyst. Well, it's customary for us in this next to the last show of the year to provide you with a year-in-review analysis of what happened in 2017. There's lots to talk about, so let's get started. If asked to provide one overarching theme to this year, I would suggest it was the year of constant battles. Legislators battled the governor, the judicial system, lawsuits and court cases were so numerous, you almost had a scorecard to keep them apart. John, redistricting lawsuits occupied more airtime this year than just about any other topic, and at year's end we still don't have much resolved. The Supreme Court affirmed a verdict by the federal district court that legislative districts were racially drawn and ordered new maps. A special master was brought in to redraw them, and the federal district court says it'll wait until January to even determine their validity. How big a problem is this delay?
Well, I think it's a significant problem. I think it is one of a series of steps that we can think of as legal gamesmanship. The three-judge panel has not actually issued a ruling. We still don't know why the maps the legislature drew the second time are violation. Nevertheless, they had the special master draw maps. They did that before they issued the ruling, I think in part to delay any potential appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Republicans think they'll do well if they get back before the high court, but they might not.
Interesting. Now, there were congressional redistricting cases that came up, Brad. Everybody seemed to be suing everybody this year.
It is, Tom. And, you know, you're correct. You have to have a scorecard. And at some point in time, I've just said, well, I'm going to wait for the final verdict to come in. Trying to keep track of all of it is very frustrating, especially if you're involved in any type of legislative races. I mean, there's so much uncertainty in the air, and we're getting ready to go into filing period. We're almost 30 days out from filing.
Yeah. And of particular interest are the judicial elections, because the legislators have done away with the
They don't even know the maps.
They don't have any primaries.
The maps have been proposed, but they hadn't been enacted. So the legislature's got to get going here.
Any movement that we see on this, Becki?
Well, I mean, it's working its way through the courts, but, you know, this does pose very slowly, and it does pose a problem because one of the requirements for the legislative races is the candidate has to live in the district. Well, when you don't know where those lines are, you don't know what your district's going to look like.
Like shooting fish in a barrel.
Yeah, and for the congressional districts, now you don't have to live in the district, but still it helps for you to do that. Here we are during the holidays. A lot of candidates are talking to their families while they have some time off and, you know, kind of gauging that, meeting with possible constituents, thinking about fundraising, making those plans. The filing starts, as Brad said, in less than 30 days. I think it ends February 28th. So, you know, the clock's ticking, and this is, running for office is a very serious commitment. And if we want to get good people, good qualified people to run for public office, to make many of these decisions that we talk about every week on NC Spin, we've got to make the process such that it at least is reasonable for people to make those kind of decisions.
Two quick points. The irony, though, of course, is that while the General Assembly is complaining about all these things, they don't, as we've already mentioned, the people who want to run for judge next year don't know what their districts are. So they're throwing a whole uncertainty in the third branch of government while they're complaining about the uncertainty in their own branch of government. It's also worth pointing out the Supreme Court heard this year arguments that gerrymandering for political reasons is unconstitutional. There's going to be a ruling probably in June They could throw the case out. They could say that it's entirely unconstitutional, or as we have said on this show, they could say extreme gerrymandering is unconstitutional and not define it, which would be a whole new level of uncertainty as we go forward.
I think there's a valid question. If Judge Wynn is so doggone worried about the legislative maps being unconstitutional, why is it taking you so long to get the ruling to the people so that you can take action? It's unacceptable.
I think it is clearly a decision to try to reduce the possibility that this will go back to the U.S. Supreme Court. Remember that when the original maps went to the Supreme Court and were struck by the Supreme Court, it's because Clarence Thomas, who usually votes with the more conservative members, voted with the more liberal members against North Carolina's position. His position is that race shouldn't be used at all to draw districts. That's what the Republicans said they did the second time. So I don't think that Judge Wynn, taking him at face value, the Democrats and the legislature, they don't want this to get back to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think this is part of that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that this certainly looks like the reason why that ruling has not been issued.
Well, it looks like he's slow walking it. It really does. And I don't know. I don't understand. You know, for them to have all the outrage that they've had, it doesn't make any sense for them to be slow walking it right now.
On the other hand, the General Assembly could have redrawn these districts months before they did. They did the same thing.
Well, I think it's important to point out, too, that this is not just happening in North Carolina. These cases are before the U.S. Supreme Court. One of the things that we're waiting on is a decision on the Wisconsin case, and then the Supreme Court has just recently agreed to hear a case out of Maryland on redistricting and the gerrymandering. So as frustrated as we are here in North Carolina and the problems that it poses, this is happening across the country. That's why I think it's important for the United States Supreme Court to make a decision for, this has been going on for 30 years, for them to make decisions in this so that states across the country know what the rules are and can proceed with redistricting and elections and setting up processes.
It's hard to disagree, Becki, with what you're asking the Supreme Court to do, but I would not expect them to do it. Because as Chris is getting at, they might very well issue a ruling in the Wisconsin and Maryland cases, but the ruling might be so narrow that it just is an invitation to endless litigation for decades to come.
Which I think exactly explains why this has gone on and on without any resolution, is because nobody knows what the rules are, and the rules keep changing.
You know, the bottom line is the judges need to get off the pot, give us a ruling, let's get going.
Or just let NC Spin determine the rules.
We could draw the maps right here.
Quickly.
You know, I think probably in about 37 minutes we could get this whole thing resolved.
You bet.
Next week's going to be our 1000th show and last show on this station. We have some special treats that are going to be up for you. In addition to giving you our predictions of what to expect in 2018, some of our panelists let you get in the inside with them. I recognize next Sunday is New Year's Eve, but hope that you'll strongly encourage you to watch show number 1000 next Sunday.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Agriculture is the backbone of our state's economy. It's the heartbeat of our rural communities. Its strength means bustling sidewalks and open signs in store windows. And with smart investments in our future, like the Plant Sciences Initiative and modern updated research stations, agriculture will remain the cornerstone of our economy. Because when agriculture is strong, our economy is strong.
For more than 45 years, the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association has advocated for local and state government retirees. Whether protecting retiree benefits or fighting for cost of living adjustments, more than 70,000 members count on us to be their voice. Government retirees work for us, and we stand for them. Learn more at ncrgea.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
The never-ending legislative session came to Raleigh in early January to get organized and decided to stay most of the year. While they officially wrapped up most of their business just before July 4th, at least 3 special sessions convened to deal with issues. Another is expected early next month. Becki, some believe the most significant piece of legislation that came out of this session was the repeal of HB 2. Do you agree? And if not, what was the most significant bill passed?
I'm not sure that the repeal of HB2 was the most significant bill, but it was clearly a significant bill. And Tom, the reason why I say that is there was so much attention paid to that. All during the election, that's what we heard. We couldn't seem to get past the bathroom bill in order to talk about other things. So the fact that finally, after the election, after a lot of controversy, after a lot of negative national attention that we got for that, they finally were able to resolve it. And what it did is it opened the path then to talk about other things and to move forward and to do some really significant things. Now, I would say that the most significant piece of legislation that was passed was one that was done pretty early on. And what it did is it set aside, it made a requirement that 15% of any extra revenue that we have has to be put into a savings account. And I think that's a significant piece of legislation long term, that now it is part of our regular legislative process that when we have extra revenue, that money automatically goes into savings so that we begin to build up that savings account to pay for things like natural disasters, when the economy turns around again and perhaps we don't have the revenue stream that we have now, the surpluses that we're seeing now. We'll have that savings account where we can then, it gives us a cushion. So I think it's important that that now is built into our whole budgeting process.
Interesting. One of the things that happened in this past session was in doing the budget, the budget writers cut $10 billion out of the state attorney general's fund. The AG got really upset about it and said it was going to be hard for him to do his job. How significant was it really?
Well, I think it's significant in the sense it was a $10 million cut.
10 million,
and,
I said billion.
Almost 100 staff positions. And the impact of that, Tom, was the appellate division. And the responsibilities have now fallen upon the district attorneys to follow through on the appeals once it leaves the Superior Court bench into the Court of Appeals and up to the Supreme Court. That's putting a lot of pressure on the district attorneys and their staffs and having to track it. And they are not necessarily trained in a professional standard to work the appellate process through the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court. So it's something that the legislature needs to look at. I believe it was just pure partisan politics. We need to get over it. We need, you need some attorney generals, assistant attorney generals in the Department of Justice to handle the appellate process. I think they'll revisit that in the short session.
Budget cuts were a big topic in this past session, John. We saw, as Brad said, more money put into rainy day reserves, but we also saw individual budget cuts reduced from 5.5 to 5.2%, and corporations cut from 3 to 2.5%. How significant is this going to be long term?
You mean the tax cuts?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean it's been a long-standing series of tax reductions or tax changes really since 2011. It's even predated when there was a Republican governor, and this continued that process. This is a fundamental philosophical dispute, disagreement between the Republicans and most of the Democrats in the General Assembly. The Republicans believe that state government does important things, that the core functions and state employees and teachers got a raise, and certain things are important, but they also believe that reducing the size of government and its cost, manifest in tax rates, will make the economy stronger. So far, North Carolina's economy under the Republican legislature has done either at or above the state or the regional and national averages in economic performance. So they would argue that so far, so good. There are some gray clouds coming. We're currently in the current fiscal year, we are slightly below projected revenue, not something to panic about, but slightly below projected revenue. So we'll have to watch that over the course of the next several months. And you should expect in 2018, by the way, a significant dispute between the Democratic Governor Roy Cooper and the Republican legislature about spending in 2018.
I actually think the biggest legislative story, one of them, is not a bill at all, but I think this is the year that Raleigh turned into Washington, that the General Assembly now operates like Congress. We have special sessions. Every special session this year, no one in Raleigh, no one except the majority party's leadership knew what was going to come up. We had bills that were fused together that were completely unrelated. We did it during the session. You mentioned the $10 million cut to the Attorney General Stein's budget. That was in neither the House or the Senate budget. It came up on the last minute. The last day on the Senate floor in the middle of the night, they cut education funding from Democratic senators. We've gotten to the point where Raleigh now operates like Washington, and it came back to haunt. I've said this on the show before. When the Democrats were in control back in the 80s especially, they did things in this manner in that era without the technology, and it came back to haunt them, and their own members rebelled. We are at that point, I believe, in Raleigh, that the way the General Assembly conducts itself, the secrecy, the crazy bills, the last-minute committee substitutes that nobody knows what they are, is really outrageous, and I actually think there are a lot of rank-and-file legislators who are upset about it.
I'll tell you, another major component of the budget was the 9% pay raise for classroom teachers in an incremental format in a 2-year period of time. But still, it is significant in the fact that the legislature went and invested in our public education and in our public classroom teachers.
One other thing on the tax cuts too, don't forget that the standard deduction was increased, so that zero tax bracket was increased yet again, which impacts the low income earners. So when you've got corporate tax cuts, you've got personal income tax cuts, and you've got the increase in the standard deduction, kind of everybody gets a benefit from those tax cuts.
Millionaires got a $20,000 a year tax cut. It's important to remember.
And the other major story, I think, as far as the budget's concerned, is that legislature started 2 years ago on a pay-as-you-go effort on road construction and highway construction in the state. And you're seeing orange barrels all over the state of North Carolina, practically in every single county in the state right now. We do have an issue coming on the horizon, is the reduction of gasoline revenue, sales tax revenue from gasoline into the state. So we've got to look at a long-term funding formula for road construction and highway construction. The U.S. Census Bureau earlier in the week, Tom, said North Carolina was 5th in the nation for growth this past year. So we're continuing to see growth, in particular in our metro areas, and infrastructure investment is going to be critically important.
A real quick point since we're talking about budgets and taxes, the federal tax reform that just passed is going to in fact impact North Carolina's budget and tax system in a number of ways. The corporate tax base is different. It might affect excise taxes. There is going to have to be some adjustment to changes in the federal code. That happens every time there's a major change in the federal code, but that'll be another big issue budgetarily in 2018.
And when you talk about the federal tax plan that just passed and all of the attention that that's been getting, I think it's important to remember in North Carolina, not only have we cut taxes, we've also cut spending, and we've reined in the growth of government. And that's one of the criticisms that a lot of people have of the federal tax cuts, is they didn't rein in the growth of government. They didn't cut spending at the same time that they're cutting taxes. We did that in North Carolina. We got it right.
Interesting. All right. We're going to take a break, come back, and review education in 2017.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Life's busy, but you are the master at managing it. Thanks to your know-how and some helpful tools. As a member of an electric cooperative, you have access to lots of innovative tools that help you better manage your home energy use and your budget, so you can stay focused on what's most important. Discover how your electric cooperative can help you control your energy use at EmpowerMeNC.com.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
We saw some interesting trends this year in education, as once again the subject of governance of our state-supported schools reared its ugly head with no year-end resolution, following a hastily called special session late in 2016 that gave the superintendent more power to run schools while challenging the governors and State Board of Education authorities. Chris, The state board and the superintendent are locked in a lawsuit, and it's pretty evident they don't like each other. But now lawmakers seem intent on changing the basic funding formula for public education. Are we trying to change too many variables at one time here?
Well, the only thing I'll say, again, as I mentioned in the last segment, that you mentioned there was a fight between the superintendent and the school board. It's worth noting they're both Republican-led. Bill Kobe, a former state Republican Party chair, runs the school board. We have a new superintendent in 2017, Mark Johnson, who's a Republican. They've been fighting basically since the beginning. That the North Carolina Supreme Court is going to hear that case. If we had had hearings about school governance, like we're going to have, I hope, it seems to be about school finance, we may not have this lawsuit. That was passed in a special session. Nobody knew what was coming. There was no testimony. It was just sprung on everybody. That's why it's tied up in the courts. It's now going to the North Carolina Supreme Court. On the school financing system, we actually have two groups. Governor Cooper also has convened a special task force. I don't know what actually he calls it. The General Assembly has had a lot of hearings. I think we are going to see some significant changes in the way our schools are funded. We haven't looked at it in a long time. They are not talking about adequacy of funding, which I still think is an issue that we should address. We spend less per capita on students in North Carolina than we did before the Great Recession in the mid-2000s or 2007. But I do think we're going to see a lot of movement this year in school finance.
All right, well, John, let's chase that rabbit for a minute. If we're going to change the funding formula, what are the potential ways we can change it?
Well, the current formula has been developed over decades. It has a bunch of different buckets, a bunch of different forms. There are other states that use what they would call a more child-centered or money follows the student sort of a system. Now, the folks at the Department of Public Instruction and some of their defenders argue that's not all that radically different from what North Carolina does, but I beg to differ. North Carolina's system is unnecessarily complex. And there's also been an argument, well, this isn't the problem is inadequate funding. Actually, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. If you believe that we should spend 15 or 20% more, or 5% more, or 50% more, or whatever, you still have to decide how to distribute the funds in the most efficient way. Having a system that has a base allotment per student, adjusted for learning disabilities or other special needs, adjusted for high poverty status and so forth, is an appropriate system. I think it's a system. I think it's where we're going. I hope it's where we end up.
We saw high school graduation rates continued to increase this past year. We got up to 86.5%, although there was evidence that the reading scores and math scores and science scores were somewhat stagnant, Becki. Any reason for that?
What this tells us is we still have a lot of work to do. There have been significant changes in education over the last several years. We've seen an explosion of school choice. More charter schools are available. Opportunity scholarships are available to low-income kids to go to private schools of their choice. We've seen some changes in these achievement school districts and looking at where the schools in North Carolina that really have a long history of failing their students. How are we going to fix those? They've got these sort of superhero teams they're putting together to go in and rescue those schools, turn those around. So, you know, when you look at that data and the statistics, I think what it tells us is we still have a lot of work to do. We're on the right path. You mentioned the scores are staying stagnant now. They're not going down as they were for a number of years. So we're on the right path. We just need to continue on that. The school funding is part of that to make sure that the money is spent where it needs to be done.
A lot of that, Becki, has got to come from the person in the classroom, the teacher. And we've got to look at getting, you know, a higher level of professionalism in our classrooms to improve student performance. And that means we've got to invest more money in teaching our students to be teachers and paying them a professional salary, Tom.
Well, we got into this business about reducing classroom size, particularly with K through 3 grades. But the legislature never gave any additional money appropriations for being able to do it. How significant is that? Is that like going up to a stone and saying, give me water?
Well, there's a fundamental trade-off here. If you're going to spend more money on teaching or teachers, you can either pay the existing teachers more in some fashion, or you can hire additional teachers. You can't do the same. You can't do both things with the same pot of money. My reading of the evidence suggests we should be focusing on not reducing class size as much as increasing the quality of teaching. And so I think that particular idea is not as high, should not be as high a priority as working on teaching compensation and the way we distribute funds.
But schools are struggling with a class size mandate that
Yes.
they say they don't have enough money to do. Actually, the legislature split. The state house was ready to fix that permanently, and the Senate leadership didn't go along with it. You're going to be hearing more about that this coming year.
But studies tell us too that having fewer students in the classroom really does have better outcome, particularly in the lower grades. So I think we are going to hear more about this.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about health care, crime control, and potpourri.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
I'm going to go around the horn and ask the panel to pick the significant issue on health care and crime control. Becki?
I'm going to mention raise the age. That was something that the General Assembly did this year, where they raised the age from so that juveniles, 16 and 17-year-olds, are tried as juveniles, treated as juveniles rather than adults. This is, I think, a significant movement towards crime control, and will lead to other reforms within
significant
the
issue, Chris.
system.
I think as we switch to a managed care system in North Carolina, which I'm not thrilled about, we have evidence that there's a little bit of a problem with the Cardinal healthcare system in Winston-Salem, the exorbitant salaries, the parachutes. You have to be very careful when you turn things over to private operators.
Brad?
Healthcare, Tom, price points is a major concern in the insurance market, not only in North Carolina, but all across the nation. And Congress is really going to have to work under regular order on healthcare reform and find affordable healthcare coverage.
Interesting. John?
We've had a spate of tragic killings in several North Carolina prisons. It's going to be a big issue in 2018.
So crime control and prison safety is going to be a big topic in the short session.
I believe so. Yes.
And hiring.
Yeah.
Well, from what I understand, they're having trouble finding people who want to fill these jobs.
Some of the issue is the base pay, and some of it is location.
And a new director named this week, Superior Court Judge Reuben Young, was brought in, former Secretary of Public Safety.
Representative Bob Steinberg has really assumed a leadership position in this as well in the General Assembly. So I think we'll see some legislation proposed, some real changes going forward. It's a serious issue, and I'm delighted to see the General Assembly and the Governor's office really taking this seriously.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback and read my weekly column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And next week, we're going to have our 1000th show and a lot of special stuff you're going to want to see. So I hope you'll tune in next Sunday morning. Stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.